Good afternoon and welcome to another live episode of Deep Dive. All things politics are on our minds today, and as I've written for years, politics is economics and vice versa. Economics is politics. You can try and avoid one subject, but at some point you realize, especially in the post-pandemic environment, that they're completely intertwined. One cannot be spoken of without the other. I'm so pleased this afternoon to have both Neil Howe and JT Taylor with me, two brilliant minds in this space. You could not bring together a better pool of talent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Great being here, Danielle.
So I tweeted out right before we came on the air that I was going to ask what nobody wanted to say out loud. I was going to ask the probing, pressing questions. And I think that one of the reasons that's always kind of plagued me is in fact, Peggy Noonan won a Pulitzer Prize for the work that she did prior to Trump being elected president on the silent majority, on the Americans who have no voice in politics, and neither party really serves them. And there are two areas I'd like to delve into first. The first of which is our national debt. It's been a very curious last 12 months. You know, we've had the prior two administrations have been in a foot race to outspend one another. Your average working mother, single working mother of two, the day the CARES Act was passed, was making somewhere around $61,953. We did the math. And we saw this mass exodus from the labor force of low-paying professions. I've seen it play out with a lot of my friends, trying to desperately get coverage for their parents as they age, as these boomers age to where they need assisted living. The nursing home industry is absolutely in a tatters right now. And yet, we continue to spend money like we're drunken sailors. I'm going to throw a few figures out there. National debt ended 2019 at $22.7 trillion. It's $34.2 trillion today. So about $11.5 trillion in the last 4 years, a 50% increase. As I argue, the current expansion is in its 175th month, because I don't believe that forcibly shutting the economy and reopening it with 50% of GDP in a very short period of time of fiscal spending constitutes what we would consider to be a recession. But my question to both of you, JT, we'll start with you, is how much longer can we go on like this? Is there a limit? Let's throw a chart up there to demonstrate, to illustrate how crazy things have gotten here in the last few years. This is no longer plain vanilla debt spending. How much longer can this go on, JT? And then, Neil, I'd ask the same question of you.
Yeah, Danielle, I mean, this is the $64,000 question here in DC. It's just a matter of years. Probably within the next decade, we're going to be, if you look at entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, we're blowing the roof off on those two entitlements, bar discretionary spending, right? So the trajectory we're on right now is unsustainable. I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be saddled with so much debt. I mean, there are stats now that we're going to be paying much more interest on this 34 trillion that you mentioned than ever before. But where I'm stuck, Danielle and Neil, is that the leadership in Washington, whether it's the past administration, the current administration, this Congress, or even the next Congress, lacks the willpower to tackle these issues. Both parties, both houses, and the White House lack the stomach to tackle these. And that's a big problem with it. Congress is divided as it is right now. And I don't believe, if my predictions and our predictions hold out, it's going to get any better in 2024, 2025 when they take issue. By the way, the very first issue out of the gate, Danielle, in 2025 is raising the debt ceiling again. Mm-hmm. So We're going to be back at this in 2025. This debate's going, there are people in both parties, by the way. I don't mean to paint both parties with the same brush. There are Republicans and a few Democrats out there who want to tackle the debt, who want to establish, there's always this talk of establishing a debt or deficit commission. You've got to do it with teeth. You just can't say that we have a debt problem, right? We have a debt problem. All right, here's what we need to do about it. That's what I'm hoping this current speaker does. He's talked about a debt commission that kind of fell by the wayside with the current budget battle. And it looks as if there are a few folks in the Senate that want to revive, in both parties, that want to revive some sort of debt commission. But until in my opinion, until the American people start pressuring their legislators, their elected officials, these folks aren't going to budge.
So Neil, jump in here. When I flashed up that chart, if I was to switch the names between Trump and Biden, you might not be able to tell the difference. This is both of them. And theoretically, if Trump comes in, those tax cuts, they're not going anywhere.
Danielle, I hate to say this, but I've been looking at this issue my entire career. This goes back decades. It was Joe Califano back in the mid-'70s, who first talked about the unaffordability of the graying of America. This is when HHS was called HEW. That was kind of like antediluvian era. I wrote a book with Pete Peterson in the late 1980s called On Borrowed Time, which is all on the growth of entitlements and how unaffordable it was. But it's gotten worse. I launched into Trump. I think this was in fiscal year 2019, when he ran a deficit. He approved of it. He thought it was great, of nearly 5% of GDP, non-recession peacetime deficit. That's been the largest in our history, right? That we had that, and now it's up, over 8% in this last year with Biden. It's getting worse. Now, my analysis is that right now we have an electorate with very little trust. And both parties are trying to get a decisive majority to sort of change history. So there's a sense of, we got to do everything to win first, right? I think that's the mentality. And that means opening up the sluice gate in benefits. No one's going to try to take away, one of the few things that people, the ordinary people think that have the going for them, right? Which is they still get Obamacare, they still get Medicaid, they still get Medicare, they still get Social Security. In reality, what I think is that these issues will not be addressed until there's a crisis, and it will be a combination of the Fed not being able to control inflation anymore, with extreme demands by the government for new resources, which are completely unaffordable in the current fiscal, kind of inherited fiscal commitments, together perhaps with an exchange rate crisis, right? As investors around the world lose faith in our ability to pay back. One particular document, Danielle, I want to point out to all viewers, and this is issued roughly every year. The CBO is going to come out with it again in June or July, I think, and that is their 30-year projection. That's their 30-year projection of the economy and the fiscal balance. That goes completely off the charts, even assuming the very low real interest rates that they have traditionally assumed on the 10-year. Once those interest rates gets adjusted back to where they are now, which is, real interest rates up around 2%, it's gonna cause shockwaves in Congress. It's either gonna happen this summer or it will happen in the next year, but those alone may simply force Congress. We may have a system if the long-awaited recession or the vibe session turns into a real recession arrives. We may be in the position where the Fed can't do much, but fiscal policy has to contract at the same time anyway, due to the impending debt problem. Everyone in Congress says, yes, we know it has to be handled. We know we can't wait longer. But of course, politically, their hands are tied now. They don't think they can do it and remain in office at the moment.
JT, let me hop real quick to another elephant in the room. Do you think the electorate is aware. Trump used FEMA to extend unemployment benefits. He used the CDC to extend the rental eviction moratorium. Biden has absolutely flaunted the Supreme Court's ruling on paying back student debt by executive ordering bits and pieces, dribs and drabs, billions here, billions there. Do you think the electorate is aware of how much spending is occurring that's not legislated?
No, I don't. I think you probably have elements of the electorate that are aware, but by and large, I don't think they have any idea. I will say, though, on the student loan front, that has hit a particular nerve. So you do have folks that and if you raise that more awareness on issues like student loans and what Biden has done since the Supreme Court tossed that aside, knocked that down, I think people become agitated. So there is some awareness out there, Danielle. Nowhere, and by the way, it's growing, and I think the student debt issue is just one small portion of it. I do believe it's growing. I do believe that with folks like us continuing to ride herd on the issue will help, but it should become a campaign issue. By the way, both the titular heads of the party right now refuse to talk about the debt or the deficit. Absolutely refuse it. It has to be forced from the ground up. There has to be a groundswell. And Neil said, we've got this issue potentially coming forward in this Congress. And I think you'll start to see more of it on the campaign trail. I think you'll see it in House races and Senate races. I don't know that the presidential candidates are going to even address it.
Yeah,
So let's go to the really, really, really big elephant right now. Because a certain female on the campaign trail has brought up the issue of the malfeasance, and she has brought out numbers, and she's shown that she's done her homework. So the other big elephant in the room is somebody who takes 2/3 of the independent vote in one state. She took 41% of the overall vote, with Trump taking obviously more than that, and the balance. My question is this: is it normal to see 2 states go by? And given the loud voice of the independents in the state of New Hampshire, is it normal to see 2 states come and go and a political party throw the potential other opponent who's never been debated to the wolves and say, fait accompli, we're finished?
I personally don't believe so. This is unprecedented, by the way, and we're not even, typically it's, by Super Tuesday, March 5th, or maybe even March 12th. I do believe it's unprecedented, and I do think it's a little premature, but if New Hampshire was very favorable, the New Hampshire electorate with independents voting and some Democrats, probably the most favorable Nikki Haley is going to have it. In fact, I think she's struggling by well into double digits in South Carolina, probably somewhere, Neil probably has this number off the top of his head, but she's probably in the mid-20s from a point percentage behind Trump right now in her home state, and runs the risk of being embarrassed, frankly. But it is early, and she is finally bringing up issues, right? I mean, the issues haven't really been discussed much at that level, and she's trying to get Trump to do a one-on-one debate. I suspect that if she's embarrassed, or looks like she's going to be embarrassed in South Carolina, she may drop. Everyone says they're going to stay in as long as possible. But I know Neil will agree, historically, it's super early, super premature. And just as they're starting to talk about issues, she may be out of the race.
This is kind of like Al Gore, Neil.
Yeah, Danielle, I think, first of all, I want to agree with JT that the New Hampshire independent vote was the absolute optimal. They tend to be kind of relatively blue zone. They're educated, they're relatively urban, they're professional. I mean, they're everything that a Nikki Haley could want in an available, voting, electorate in the middle. I will say, though, that, I could throw this back a while, maybe JT can answer. It's also unusual that we're down to only 2 candidates, with one with such a large lead over the other. It's kind of, I do understand people frustrated on the Nikki Haley side with the fact that some people want to shut it down. On the other hand, and maybe JT, you could outline it, what would be a successful path forward, realistically for Nikki Haley, given that there's no more opposition out there to amalgamate? You know what I mean?
Yep.
So now I think one option is wait to see what happens with all the trials and everything else, maybe even mortality itself. God knows what can happen over the next year. So that is an option. But I will emphasize one other thing that we haven't been talking about. There is a war right now, a civil war within the Republican Party to redefine the party. And right now, one of the reasons why Trump supporters, the MAGA side, is so enlivened against Nikki Haley is because of all the donors, right? And JT can speak to this, right? But the whole idea is that Nikki Haley is getting, and as you know, this came up with Vivek Ramaswamy when he attacked Nikki Haley, and this has come up with a number of attacks on Nikki Haley. She's getting all these rich donors, and for better or for worse, whether this is true or not, JT, this is the image, right? That she's being supported by all these rich people. Trump is a candidate of the downtrodden, the populist everyman and every woman, and that this is a war worth fighting over. I'd be interested, JT, in your take on that. That's certainly what the Trump side wants this to be portrayed as. Is that not right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, if she's really going to fight to the end, right, she has to decide whether or not she is going to be the anti-Trump in a pro-Trump party, right? And whether or not that helps her with her, if she chooses to run again in 2028. If this is her last stand, then she's likely finished. But maybe she is one of the few principled folks on both sides that's willing to take that stand, that's willing to talk about the issues that Danielle mentioned. 1, 2, there's also a shot. I think from the donor side, I think some of these folks are going to continue to stay on the sidelines, wait to see what happens in South Carolina. Again, much more difficult terrain in South Carolina than in New Hampshire, as we just said. But she's got to decide whether or not she waits to see what happens with the Trump, a potential Trump conviction. She's got to wait to see what happens with, frankly, this third party, which I suspect we'll talk about in a second, whether or not there's a third party component to this, no labels or someone else out there, or whether she wants to amass delegates staying in beyond South Carolina, amassing delegates along the way to have some leverage at the convention. A lot can happen between now and the convention in July of this year, and whether or not she takes that leverage and tries to negotiate with Trump, the master negotiator, or she threatens to go on a no labels ticket. I mean, she has a couple of options. She's not limited as to what her future is. I do think, though, that she runs the risk of being, as I said, the anti-Trump candidate in a very, very pro-Trump party.
That's the problem. In other words, that she amasses animosity among Republicans faster than she amasses delegates.
Yep.
And that's the real issue. I mean, already no one's mentioning her as a VP candidate. I don't know if we could talk about, Trump's potential VPs, but that's impossible now because I think of all that, there are other candidates out there, right?
Well, let's stay on this subject of civil war within the GOP for just a minute. Former editor of the Wall Street Journal, now he is one of their senior writers, Gerard Baker, happens to be a friend of mine. He had a column out in the Wall Street Journal here in the last 24 hours, and he relayed an anecdote, a conversation that Winston Churchill had on a train talking up a woman. And I'm going to read that right now and then ask for both of your reactions. So he and a woman again were speaking on a train. Winston Churchill says to her, "Tell me, my dear, if I offered you £1 million, would you sleep with me?" The woman was taken aback, but pondered for a moment and said, "Well, you are a very old man, sir, but obviously distinguished. I would have to think about it." So Winston Churchill says, "While you're thinking, let me ask you another question. Would you sleep with me if I gave you £1?" To this, she replies, "Mr. Churchill," she responds indignantly, "what kind of a woman do you think I am?" Yeah. And he replies, "Miss, we've established what kind of a woman you are. Now we're merely negotiating the price." So this anecdote was shared in the context of an article about individuals within the Republican Party who Trump has belittled, name-called, degraded, insulted 6 ways to Sunday, who are now groveling at his feet. effectively apologizing. I was young, I needed the money. Why is there so little accountability in the Republican Party? I'm just going to ask it out loud. Why is there such fear within the party of Donald Trump when so many, as you saw, as we've seen in one poll after another, when so many Americans wouldn't vote for him or Biden?
You want to take that on first, JT?
No, go ahead. Yeah, I mean,
neither of you probably wants to answer the question, but why is it how it is? They've all got nicknames and they're all saying sorry.
It's fear. I mean, when you think about, and I know Neil has great stats on this, but when you look at the size of his of the base over the since 2015, 2016, it is formidable. There's talk that Trump has a very high ceiling, and I'm sorry, that Trump has a very, very high floor and a very low ceiling, right? That high floor is what's carrying him to each and every passing election. And by the way, the high floor is what's motivating the base voters in these congressional districts as well. So there is an element of fear within the Republican Party, in my opinion, of retribution. And that's what it boils down to. I mean, I don't know what else there is. From an issue standpoint, if you go back to the first term, you'll hear a lot of folks say, we do agree with Trump on the issues. We don't agree with his approach, but he was successful in tax policy and a number of other things. But when you look at the numbers of his base, of the Republican Party, they're the ones that turned out. They're the ones that turned out in the primaries, and they're the ones that it's a fuel that's it's his rocket fuel that's propelling him forward time and again. It's not the vast majority of the party, but right now it's just enough to get him over the finish line.
So politics, effectively politics by extortion, Neil.
And extortion and power. I mean, this is the raw thing. It's not exclusive to the Republicans, by the way.
Right.
Democrat, but they're all craven by the drive to hold on to power.
Neil?
I think you have to start with this basic fact, and that is the core of the MAGA movement, and this is the mobilizable part of the Republican Party that may not come out in an ordinary election. They won't come out maybe if Nikki Haley runs, right? That's Trump's Trump's trump card, so to speak. In other words, everyone knows that when Trump runs, he mobilizes a certain sector of America. These are lower income, less educated Americans, right? In places like where I live, and they come out for him. They won't come out for an ordinary Republican. And I think what you have to remember is for this part of America, they fear they're losing the America they knew, all right? They fear that this is a crisis point, and they don't mind. In fact, they endorse having a pretty authoritarian leader, a strong man, right? Who doesn't brook much opposition, who will cut corners, who will do whatever it takes to take command of an America they fear that they are losing forever. And that is a strong dynamic. And I think on top of that is the fact, and I think JT alluded to this, is that partly because of the way we've been changing the primary rules, I think Trump just has it all sewn up. There's so many states now where when he wins just even a slight majority, it's winner take all. Isn't that right, JT?
They've changed the rules along the way.
Yeah, and they no longer have runoff elections. I mean, everything has been jiggered now so that Trump really is going to roll, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly on Super Tuesday. Plus, Trump is now doing pretty well in national polls. I mean, I've discussed at length the Siena College New York Times poll that came out about a month ago. That was a blockbuster, right? I mean, that really woke up the Democrats in Washington. It showed Trump winning 5 out of the 6 battleground states over Joe Biden. Not only that, it showed, and this is something I actually talked about in my most recent piece on Demography Unplugged. Where he's doing best is among young people. There's a huge shift among millennials. These are under 40 voters, underage 40 voters who are no longer, it's not that they're necessarily pro-Trump, but they're no longer pro-Biden. And that would be huge, because if Trump can get that, it's easy to see how he can easily come in first in the election in 2024. I don't know. What do you think, JT? I think it's the fact that the primary roles now are paving the way for him, that polls see he can beat Biden, and that you have this this militant, almost apocalyptic core on the Trump side that say anything Trump wants to do is good, and if it's drastic, that's okay, because that's where America is right now.
So, JT, I'm going to interrupt for just a second,
Yep.
because there's a flip side of this coin that came out in a recent Gallup poll. If we could, Eric, if we could put that second chart up. The biggest takeaway, what's gotten the most press is that yellow line, and that's a record number of voters who identify as independents, not necessarily card carrying, but in the fine print of this fresh Gallup poll, said very, very quietly, is the decline to 27% who identify as Democrats is the lowest on record. JT, do you think that there are Americans out there who are never Biden?
I do. I mean, just go back to New Hampshire and exit polling in New Hampshire. There are plenty. I think it's probably closer to the mid-20s Republicans. Exit polls in New Hampshire show there were low 20s, 22% of Republicans that voted in New Hampshire would not vote for Trump in a general election. Biden is about 12 or 13% coming out of New Hampshire as well. So Biden's numbers are in double digits. They're not insignificant, by the way. So I do believe that there are a number of independents and of course Democrats that won't vote for Biden. Remember, Trump has the high floor, low ceiling. Biden has the low floor, high ceiling. I think that's why there's all this panic right now. Independents, the way they're breaking, and you'll love to hear what you have to say on this, but independents right now, when you look at New Hampshire and even Iowa to an extent, likely won't vote for Trump, right? But it doesn't mean they're going to vote for Biden. You know, the biggest scare here is a third party emerges out of this. Hence that big number that Danielle just popped up. If there's a third party threat here, I think the $64,000 question between now and the conventions is who does that damage the most?
Yeah, just to interject here, 2 points on this. One is that be careful in looking at independents. And you especially see this among young people. Young people almost never identify with a party, but increasingly larger shares of them identify as either conservative or progressive. And what a lot of pollsters now do is they don't pay so much attention to party membership. They look at Democratic or Republican leaning, because it turns out that a lot of these independents very predictably vote for one party or the other. So just that people don't want to say that they actually belong to a party. I mean, who wants to actually sully themselves with an actual membership and utterly corrupt politics today? Doesn't mean that you don't have a clear red zone, blue zone preference. I totally agree with JT. This third party is either going to amount to a lot or nothing, depending on whether it can gain critical mass. And maybe JT, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about no labels, how successful they are. Mm-hmm. Some of these candidates are obviously having trouble. Obviously, the Democrats and the Republicans as parties in every state are fighting furiously to prevent these parties from actually, putting their names on the ballots. So you got the Cornel Wests and the Kennedys and all these people and Marianne Williamson and all the rest. But the big deal with the most money is no labels. Who are they going to put on the top of their ticket, and how many states will they be able to put their candidate on? And by the way, are they even going to decide? Right? I mean, they have constantly announced, if we don't feel like we can win the election, we're not going to run anybody. Is that right?
That's right, and I think they're going to make an announcement apparently by the springtime, guys. And so, but as I understand it, they're about to qualify for ballots in 13 states, including Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina. Think about those three states and think about the importance those three states were in that past election. So I think we'll know by the springtime whether or not they're going to have enough juice to qualify for more ballots in 13 states. By the way, I would not dismiss those 13 states. Remember, this is the Electoral College. This is not a popular vote. And then secondly, from a candidate standpoint, I mean, we're going to hear everybody and anybody under the sun, from Chris Christie to even Nikki Haley. I mean, I was in a meeting last week where, though, she doesn't succeed as a Republican and she doesn't retain her viability in the Republican Party. As I said, she's anti-Trump in a pro-Trump party that's going to continue to be pro-Trump even after this election. Does she pivot and potentially look at no labels? So I think they're looking at a number of candidates right now. I do think that Manchin is going to factor into a unity ticket, regardless. I think
that was my next question. That was my next question to both of you is, we see him, he pops up. We know that he's certainly got broad-based appeal. And you would think to yourself, why doesn't somebody just put Joe Manchin and Nikki Haley on a ticket and call it a day?
That would be formidable, but
JT, what I want to know is from you, whether it's clearly the Democrats who fear this third candidate more than Republicans, and with good reason, right? Yeah. Because the Republicans are going to look at this as Tweedledum, Tweedledee. Two people who want to run the deep state, choose one of them or the other. These are the people that are on the take. They get the big, they take all the people with university degrees. They run this thing that we hate. Choose one or the other of them, right? I think the Democrats know that that's how people are going to see it, and particularly if they put a Democrat, they put even a Joe Manchin on the top, and certainly Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy's going to be running on his own, obviously. But the question is, doesn't this really work to Trump's advantage? We could have an 1860 election. Mm-hmm. Lincoln gets elected with 40% of the vote. In other
words, hurts a third party right now. Again, I haven't really thought through if it's a Haley Manchin ticket, but I definitely think it hurts Biden much more than it hurts Trump right now. Again, let's see what happens and who they pick at the end of the day. But if it were, think about where suburban women would go right now with Haley on the ticket. Maybe not Manchin, but with Haley on the ticket. Again, pretty unlikely, but you can't rule it out. That would be a formidable ticket. You know what? I think historically, Neil, I don't think any independent candidates got more than single digits in recent memory. I think we would see a serious effort with a credible or viable Republican running along with Manchin. And then secondly, Danielle, bringing this full circle, I think one of the things Manchin does to the debt deficit debate, it does bring that front and center. That is his baby. I think he would raise awareness this election year. So I see nothing. I see Manchin as a boon for the three of us who really know that something has to be done to address. He's behind, along with a couple of Republicans, at least on the Senate side, trying to bring this to the fore from a commission standpoint. So this would be his premier issue, which I think would be great for America.
Let's stay on money for a second.
Just raising awareness of the debt.
Right, right. Let's stay on money for a second, because there is there's a certain cohort of younger people out there who are walking away from their credit card debt. They are, quote unquote, boycotting their student loans. They're taking advantage of buy now, pay later, knowing they're going to buy now but not pay later. Where did this mindset come from that a contractual obligation is not that? What is it about sticking it to the boomers that and I'm not talking about a small faction of young people here. I'm talking about quite a few people who would vote to kind of just take it easy.
Well, I mean, if you think that boomers are the problem, right? If they're taking half of the budget, you might just say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? I didn't vote for this. I wasn't around when the 1983 Greenspan Commission solved, quote unquote, Social Security. You know what I mean? They weren't part of any of these decisions. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with it. I don't think it's ever good to say that you should not follow your contributions. And let me just add here that I do think that the college debt issue is a loser overall for Biden, not based on the generational dynamic, which I actually think I'm sympathetic to, but rather because of the class dynamic. It looks terrible for the Democrats. In other words, you're basically saying we're going to tax all these Americans, most Americans who haven't not gone to college and who never will go to college, to basically pay back the debt for all these people who are going to college, right? And particularly the people who have the most debt per capita, go to these, fancy professional schools to get their MAs and business degrees and law degrees. So I just think it's a bad issue from a class perspective for Biden. But gosh, Danielle, I do agree that in the current climate where everyone feels that the system is broken, it's this attitude that we can break rules now, whether it's immigration or anything else, no rules, or if it's kind of this ruleless environment, because sooner or later there will be rules again, but I'm going to be on the other side. You know what I mean? Yep. When the rules suddenly apply again, I'll be safe.
Yep.
So let's stay on this subject from the perspective of the opposite side of the societal spectrum, if you will. For some time now, Americans have been told that inflation is a figment of their collective imagination. Now, the month of January started off with a big announcement out of Citi that they were going to be laying off 20,000. All right, fine, let the bankers go. They've already got more money than they could possibly ever use. Today, UPS announces that it's laying off 12,000. We're at nearly 100,000 job cuts in the month of January alone. It has been an earnings season to remember, with one CEO after another doing what they can to bolster their bottom line and keep their shareholders happy by cutting costs. How do you think Americans who've been told that there's no inflation are going to feel when they're also told that it's the strongest job market in the history of mankind?
Yeah, look.
Either of you jump in.
Danielle, we put out demography. We put out all about the indicators every month. And, we have a set of traffic lights, long-term negatives, medium-term negatives, short-term negatives. Right now, the long-term and medium-term are all red or yellow. The ones that still are positive, green, are the shortest term. Those are the employment indicators. That is rapidly decelerating right now, right? Every indicator we have, particularly marginal employment, when it comes to, young people, young men and women, foreign born, the disabled. I mean, we could go down a long list, right? Temp workers, overtime hours, all that kind of stuff. That's decelerating the most. That's what we see first to go. I believe you're right. I believe right now we are beginning to see the inflection point in employment. And that's the next big news that we're going to have. I'm glad to hear you talk about those layoffs.
So there's something else to consider then, right? Because in late 2019, as my mentor, Lacey Hunt, would tell me, every time the global trade has been negative for an entire calendar year, the U.S. economy has slipped into recession. The U.S. global trade was negative for all of 2019. Global trade is negative right now. But in 2019, we had the pandemic about to sweep on shore, and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars spent in a very short period of time, starting in March of 2020 with the CARES Act. Right now, as both of you acknowledge, we're just trying to keep the lights on in the government.
Oh, yeah.
Every few months or so, we just come to another continuing resolution. We're just keeping the lights on. What difference will it make if there's not major legislation, social legislation, until, say, April of 2025? What difference would recession on Election Day make? JT, I'll go to you first.
I think huge. You're going to have, depending on whoever wins the White House, you're still going to have a Congress that is. But think about this. This past year, in 2023, Kamala Harris in a divided Senate broke more ties than any other vice president in history. I think in almost 200 years, 33 or 34 ties. The current Speaker of the House, Speaker Johnson, has a 2-seat majority. And on some days, it's a 1-seat majority, as we're going to find out soon. So I don't know how we get into the spring of 2025. And we're talking about, at least in the House, an election over 23 seats. Out of 435 congressional districts, only 23 seats will be in play, Danielle. Neil knows this as well. I don't know. There's not going to be, unless there's a massive wave election, as I said earlier, there's not going to be much. The House may go from Republican to Democrat by a handful of votes, and the Senate may go from Democrat to Republican by a handful of votes. But we're going to be generally stuck with the same type of makeup, the same type of Congress that we currently have. I can't imagine that they're going to be able to pass anything in the spring of 2025, especially with the debt ceiling first out of the gate, unless there's a major crisis. And I don't even think that would bring the parties together.
Well, it doesn't have to bring the parties together. There's a major crisis, and one party has, both houses. You're right, both houses of Congress. They'll just, they'll claim prerogative, to act. I mean, they'll suspend the filibuster rule. I mean, they'll railroad stuff through. I think that's an extreme case, obviously. Look, if there is a recession going into this November, doesn't that make it harder for Biden to pull this out? JT, I mean, look how badly he's doing in the polls, and right now we got unemployment down at 3.6%.
The economy is still number one coming out of Iowa and coming out of New Hampshire. I don't care how you look at the results. The economy is still top.
The economy is stupid, right? It's the economy stupid. Yeah.
Yep.
And actually, when you're thinking about true brass tacks economics 101, and things that we learn in school are by their very definition bad, like tariffs. I mean, my God, you've got the U.S. steel industry so on its knees that you've got a foreign company coming in and buying U.S. steel. I mean, the robber barons are spinning in their graves, and yet we are pondering a new trade war under Trump, and under Biden, nothing has happened with these tariffs. And yet we're talking about ratcheting this war up one more notch, or just having it be the same.
He hasn't changed the Trump tariffs whatsoever. I think you're going to see a minor change here within the next month, maybe with EVs and other products in the supply chain. But I believe they're going to generally keep the tariffs that Trump put on the economy back in 2017. Number one. Number two, Trump is already come out saying that he's going to put a 10% universal tariff out there, and then also look to revoke permanent trade status with China, which could raise tariffs anywhere between 20 and 60%, 60%, if PNTR is revoked. In fact, that's going to be a hot debate this summer, maybe even this spring on Capitol Hill. Trump is also pushing, there's a select committee on China in the House. He is also pushing his Republican allies in Congress to bring up PNTR, revoking PNTR status for China. This is preferred trade status for China before the election. You take that away, it's a congressional vote, those tariffs go up by 20 to 60%.
Yeah, think about what's this going to do to China's economy. They're flat on their back now. Their real estate sector is imploding. They've got deflation, particularly in the manufactured products. The only thing that Xi Jinping is doing now is just expanding the manufacturing and industrial sector to export more. Is called immiserating growth, by trade economists. You just flood the world with, whatever they're now exporting, lithium batteries and solar panels and EV cars. But the point is that Biden has done plenty to not only keep the Trump tariffs, but to put on all the new Buy American provisions, right? On all the new legislation he put through. If we suddenly put a huge tariff wall, which probably is going to get Europe to do something similar. Otherwise, all the flooding, right? I mean, all the dumping goes in their direction.
Yep.
China is going to be in a very, very hard place because right now, this is their only way is to export manufacturing and basic industrial, kind of capital goods, and getting out of their current funk that way.
And Trump will wield the tariff cudgel throughout 2024. I promise you.
Oh yeah, he will. And if he gets it, he'll be selective, right? If you spend over
forcing people to the table
on NATO or something like that, we'll lower a little bit for you. In other words, he's going to be the master organist. You know, he'll be saying, "Oh yeah, you get a little favor because you pleased me last Tuesday."
Right.
So, both of what you're describing, it hurts countries that are dependent upon trade with China, such as Germany, that's already on its knees and in recession. All of Europe is going into recession. You're going to end up hurting South America as well, their economies. They're going to end up being collateral damage to what you're describing. And at some point, we're talking about an increasingly isolationist United States that's running out of allies. So let's take this one step further, because Neil, you've always said it's a toss-up. Are we going to have a world war first or a civil war first? You know, flip a coin. Oh, and I realize I'm not trying to be flippant about such a heavy subject, but if we're increasingly isolationist, doesn't that pose political and economic risk to the country?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Danielle, kind of two-part answer to your question. The first part about this increasing, backing away from globalization in terms of trade, that ship left the harbor a long time ago. We peaked in international trade as a share of global product back in 2008. So the entire last 15 years, right, we have been on a declining trend. This is simply speeding it up, right? So this is something that the world is getting familiar with.
And Neil, what typically happens historically at the end game, at the end of these cycles?
Hawley, right?
Sorry?
We all remember the Smoot-Hawley tariff.
But this is what I'm getting at, Neil.
That was a forerunner, right? I mean, that was just on the eve of the crash and the Great Recession. So these great crises typically do come in eras of increasing isolation. Look, we're reliving the 30s, right? As I have argued at great length, even at book length, we are reliving the 30s, Danielle. And I see this in almost every sphere of geopolitics, social life, and politics. One thing that happened during the 30s, by the way, is not only was there extreme isolationism, and we didn't want anything to do with any entangling alliances around the world. Even after Poland had been invaded, America did not want, it was strictly cash and carry in terms of arms. I mean, the last thing we wanted to do was to go into another foreign war. And as we know, the two parties at that time, we had rabid kind of ideological polarization in America. You either thought that the future of America was going to be communist or fascist, and we had a Great Recession that would, I should say, Great Depression, which never seemed to end. So it looked like liberal democracy was dead. There was an extreme mood in America at that time, and what you saw, and this is to kind of answer your question, Danielle, is that these two issues of domestic gridlock and polarization, and increasingly a dangerous situation around the world, fed each other, right? Our very inaction, our very failure to come to any consensus about how to act, encouraged autocrats all around the world. Yeah, take Manchuria and Mussolini, take Ethiopia. We're not going to lift a finger because we don't care. We officially don't care, right? And no one else would around the world either. There was a complete divergence of interest in what we would today call the free world or the democratic world. But that's what you see kind of today. Take a look at Ukraine. We haven't talked about Ukraine. Maybe JT, you have a new word about what's happening with that. But I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? It's sort of like a get out of jail free card. It's sort of like, come get us, right?
So
look at Iran. Look at Biden's response to Iran. Telegraphing seemingly months in advance. Well, if you really keep attacking us, maybe we'll appoint a task force to see how we might.
So actually, Neil, that's a rabbit hole. We've only got about 10 minutes left. I'm actually going to have JT go to the other flip side of the coin. So it is November the 6th. It is the day after Election Day. We've seen a tight election. Will there be one side or another that does not accept the outcome? Can you see that? And can you see it possibly happening on both sides of the ticket?
I can and I do. That fear is palpable. You can't underestimate it right now. The electorate, I believe probably a little more so if Trump is defeated, that you will see probably January 6, 2021 on steroids. Maybe not attacking Congress, but I do think that there will be, I don't know if it's a rebellion, but the outcry will be pretty sustainable, vocal, and I don't know when it ends. I do think less so if Biden is reelected, but I would say, by the way, I would say civil war over a world war because of this very issue. I think by the way, we have 10 more months of this, and they haven't even gotten started, Danielle. I mean, we have 10 more months of these two firing at each other, and I just think I think the anger with both of them is just going to increase over the next 9 months, building up to November 6th, November 7th, and I would not underestimate what happens after that. Not to sound too doomsday, but again, we're just at the very beginning. In fact, Biden just started using the Trump word within the big thing here within the Democrats. He just started using the Trump word over the past 2 weeks. But it is going to get ugly, and it's going to get ugly in probably the longest presidential cycle that we've ever seen.
So, Neil, I'm gonna switch over to Demography Unplugged for a minute. I'm gonna put my mom hat on. I have 3 teenage boys. I have 1 teenage girl. I make them stand for the flag. I make them open the door for women. And that's because I've raised them right, and I won't let her walk through a door that's not opened for her. I think my daughter might be the exception in society today. Can you talk a little bit about youth in America and how differently it is perceived by young men and young women?
Yeah, we just did a big piece on that, kind of the growing gender gap among late wave millennials. These are people basically in their 20s, and we see it growing. In fact, dramatically growing. So it's much larger than older age brackets. I think when you think of gender gap, we think of something about boomers, old feminists against old traditionalists. No, the biggest gap between genders now is among people in their early 20s. You see it on college campuses and increasingly showing up in the polls. Huge. And by the way, it's not just in the United States. We see it in Germany. We see it in Korea. We see it in China. We see it around the world now. Sort of like the bonds of sort of comedy and politeness and getting along. Even if you think of yourself as different people, you sort of have rules for getting along with each other. These are beginning to break down. And so this is disturbing. How is it linked to the current political mood in America? Where is it going? And why is it global? We explore this. I'll be doing, I did that on a piece that came out yesterday and a piece I'll be doing again in my next column.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to leave with a parting thought from both of you. Let's mark our calendars for 6 months from now and meet back here. What do you think we'll be talking about in 6 months? JT, you go first.
I think we're going to be, as people start to focus on the election. I think some are focused right now. I think it's going to come down to, we said it a couple of minutes ago, where the economy is in 6 months, what's happened on immigration, and of course, foreign affairs. Do not underestimate what's happening with in the Middle East with Gaza and what that's doing to some of the younger voters with regard to their opinions of Biden and the Biden administration. And then don't underestimate abortion as well. That issue is going to be front and center 6 months from now, as well as the other four. So I think depending on where we are, it's not a short list, and they're all pretty significant issues, but we're going to be visiting, and I think people will focus much more on where we are on the economy in 6 months. And I think that's going to drive the decision at the ballot box. And again, there is a distaste for both of these candidates. So I would not be surprised if we're talking about a third party candidate in 6 months as well.
Neil?
Yeah, I would just say on the third party candidacy, it's either no one's talking about it or everyone will be talking about it. In other words, it's going to be a threshold of critical mass. So either it really becomes viable, or everyone will regard it as just a fatal, probably a fatal arrow in Biden's side. The other issue is the economy. If the economy starts really deteriorating, again, that's going to be a problem for Biden. I agree with JT on issues. Abortion is the one good issue for Biden. He definitely has a plurality, particularly among those young women I was talking about, right? So they're huge on that issue. Unfortunately for Biden, what most voters care about, even younger voters, is the economy and increasingly national security and new topics like immigration. And unfortunately for Biden, Trump has a big lead in that, particularly completely undeserved. I mean, I don't know if you've read the latest Paul Krugman vibe session memo, but completely undeserved. But the public trusts Trump much more with the state of the economy. Apparently, they have good memories of what happened back in the late 20 teens, and just he has a huge margin in every poll that I've seen.
Yeah. And I agree. Just real quick, I do agree with Neil. By the springtime, we'll know whether or not there's a third party. So in 6 months, it could be moot, or it could be the hottest topic of the day. But we'll know in the springtime, I predict.
Well, I think you're right. I'm going to leave with my own few thoughts today. And that is that we should all remember that it takes kindling to start a fire. And the $2,000 second stimulus check that Trump insisted on getting, he did not get. He only got $600 of those $2,000. And the first order of business when Biden got into office was to get the $1,400 balance. And then we really saw what inflation could do. Running up to the double digits. I do think that inflation will be very problematic given how very little it looks like Congress is going to change in terms of its leadership and these razor thin margins of majority going forward. That means that the vice presidential candidate, whomever they are, whichever party they are, they're going to play a critical role as well. But I will leave you with this one quick story that a very young pastor who actually passed away at the young age of 44 this last year told the congregation before the last election. And that was, you can talk about politics all you want, but only if you vote. So remember in this voting year to pay attention. Don't just turn off the TV. Don't stop reading the headlines. Do your own homework. Be prepared and understand that you get a voice in this debate if and only if you do your duty and get out and vote on Election Day. This is Danielle DiMartino Booth, and I would like to thank both JT and Neil. This has been fantastic, and I look forward to the next deep dive that we take together. Live from Hedgeye, signing out. Thank you.